Hi, my name is Kyle Ruddy, and welcome to this HashiCon session on managing policy as code with Terraform and Sentinel. So as part of this session, we're going to dive into some of the new things that are available for Terraform. We already heard a little bit about what's happening during the keynote, but we're going to take an extra special look at some of the new things that's there for Terraform and Terraform Cloud and Enterprise. Then we're going to go into policy as code. How do we, kind of establish some guardrails for the way that we deploy our infrastructure as code. Then we have a special look at a brand new resource that's out there and available today called the Foundational Policies Library. And then we have a ton of demos that we're going to run through as well. Okay, so let's take a brief second to take a look at what's new for Terraform. So as of this session recording, Terraform 0.13 has been released in beta form, meaning that you can head right out to the Terraform GitHub repository and get access to the beta code and give us all kinds of feedback on what you like and what you'd like to see more of. However, some of the things that you should really be looking forward to are how we're really taking a look at making modules first-class citizens within the Terraform environment. And this is really due to some of the new additions, these arguments that we can include in the module blocks. Some arguments such as count, for each, and the one that I know a lot of people have really been looking forward to, depends on. This can really enable us to add some strength around the way that we define our modules, how we integrate other private repositories and other private modules from those repositories to really make our infrastructure as code that much more powerful. Then we also have some new integrations into the way that we connect to Terraform Cloud. Now, Terraform 0.13 will allow us to store our authentication token within the CLI, meaning that we don't have to establish that every single time that we create a Terraform configuration. And then lastly, we have some really cool integrations for taking a look and accessing third-party providers and whether they're community, whether they're partner, whether they're provided by us at HashiCorp. And it doesn't matter whether those are public through the Terraform registry or private through some of your own repositories that you're using within your own configurations and systems. Then we also have some new updates for Terraform Cloud and Enterprise. So the big one that you're going to notice immediately when you log into Terraform Cloud and Enterprise is this new Getting Started walkthrough. This is basically going to show you some of the high-level steps that you should take to really be successful with Terraform within Terraform Cloud and Enterprise. Now this is going to take you through creating workspaces, planning and running your configurations, and so much more to really make the most out of your Terraform usage. Then we have these things that are called run triggers. This kind of allows you to start having some integration pieces between your workspaces. Conceptually, this allows us to kind of build our workspaces in smaller, more deployable chunks. So then we can continue to build this pipeline process in between each of the workspaces to really make the most of our CI/CD process. And then lastly, there's been a ton of improvements to how we manage users. We've consolidated our user management page onto one single section for each organization. We've updated and allowed we do email invites for new users. It's just a really great experience. It makes it a ton easier from the management side. Okay, so let's take a look at some policy as code now. So I'm assuming everybody here knows, or at least conceptually understands, what infrastructure as code means. Being able to take code to define your infrastructure in the ways that you want it to end up existing as. Now, the really cool part about that is that I can go through and write my code to be whatever I want it to be. However, when you take a look at that from the business perspective, maybe that's not the best way to do it. Maybe we will have some organizational guidelines or some best practices within not only just the organization, but the services that you're using and consuming as well that you probably want to comply to. And that's really where policy as code comes into play. So let's take a look at one of the first real big pillars here, embedding. How do we take some of these best practices, such as, for maybe an AWS or an Azure, how do we ensure that our Terraform configurations mandatory, it's mandatory to use tags? How do we restrict the instances that we're using within each one of these services to ensure that, maybe development uses this certain size, production uses a different size, and so on and so forth. And then lastly, how do we make sure that these resources are being disposed of in the time that is needed, giving it a time to live? Then we can look at some of our organizational guidelines, some of these best practices that have been defined internally, such as, continuing down that path of using tags and making sure that those tags are declared in the same way for each one of the resources that are being consumed. Continuing to make sure that our resources that we're providing and provisioning are to the right specifications, to the right size, or using the right formatting for each one of those resources. Making sure that our development environments might not be running after hours, or in certain situations where they're not going to be utilized to the fullest extent. And then lastly, the big one here, controlling costs. Making sure that we're kind of falling in line with what the business has told us that we should be using. Then lastly, we're getting into the visibility side of this. How do we ensure that we understand that across all of our deployed instances, they're consistent in using those same instance types, falling in line with all of those cost procedures, and making sure that they're not running at inopportune times. Now here's where Terraform really comes into play, because we're starting to look at how we can use some of these private modules in order to really enforce and use some of these guidelines to the best of their capabilities. So we can create our own modules, we can share them within these private repositories and access them through Terraform, Terraform Cloud, and Terraform Enterprise. We can also go through and validate that a lot of these things are as we think they are. That's the joy of being able to define all of this as code. And then lastly, being able to access them when we publish those out to our libraries for other users within our organization to continue to consume and make use of. Plus we have Sentinel. This is our policy as code engine. This is really, when we talk about policy as code, Sentinel is the workhorse that's behind it. Taking and allowing us to create all of these policies as code, defining them as code, and then applying them to our workspaces so that we could say, hey, these are the teams that should have access to these resources, or, this particular library. We can validate that certain things are in the way that they should be in order for us to, allow our users and our consumers to continue deploying resources as they need them. And then we can also, allow them to, you're all set. Go ahead, deploy the resources that you need. We can already validate what they need to get their job done. Plus, as we're talking about teams and we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about state. Being able to manage and access and modify the state of the resources that are out there and deployed. And really that's one of the nice things about Terraform Cloud and Terraform Enterprise is that ability to manage that state across the team. Plus, there's this nice addition for cost estimation, which will give you a rough guideline about what some of these resources are actually going to cost when they're deployed to our own environments. And one last slide before we dive into a bunch of demos here, and that's the Terraform Foundational Policies Library. This is a new resource that was released recently, just this year. It's out there, it's available on GitHub for you to check out immediately today. There are over 50 different policies that are already initially available. Things for compute, applying policies to databases, virtual networks, Kubernetes, some of your storage, all types of things are out there. And they're all based on the Center for Internet Security and the benchmarks that are established within there. So I say Center for Internet Security. When you look at those benchmarks, they're already predefined by the CIS group. So what we've done is create these policies and open them, publish them out on GitHub. And when we did that, it's covering all of the major cloud providers. So that means as of today, it's AWS, Azure, and GCP. Okay, so enough with the slides. Let's dive into some demos and really show you the power of how we can make use of policy as code to really, enable our own workspaces for our organization. So within these demos, we're going to take a look at how we can kind of visualize some of our infrastructure costs through cost estimation, how we can use policies to discover some of the inopportune deployment practices, some inconsistent configurations within our environment that are trying to be deployed. And then lastly, we're going to take a look at the foundational policies library and see how easy it is to take one of those policies and apply it to one of our own existing configurations. Here we are in Terraform Cloud. The first thing that I want to call out here is this new bar that's across the top here. So if you've logged into Terraform Cloud before, you probably, you might never have seen this. This is something that's really new and really helps guide anybody that's new to Terraform Cloud in their experience. So as we can see here, I've signed up for an account, which was free. I have created my organization. In this case, it's TFTMM, and then we're ready to create some workspaces and start planning and applying our configurations. We can also check out the Get Starting page that's over here, and that'll take us through some additional information, such as some basics on using Terraform Cloud, how we can set up and create our version control systems, our VCSs, such as GitHub and GitLab or Bitbucket, whichever you're using within your environment. And then just some getting started tutorials. And then we even have some more guidance around what we can do within each area. But we're not going to do that today. Right now, off the bat, we're going to create our first workspace within this organization. It's something that I've already created and provisioned. Let me switch over to my own user account here. We're going to set up a workspace for our basic site demo here. So fairly simple, straightforward, just pulling that out, that Terraform configuration directly from GitHub. After a few seconds, we can see that our configuration was uploaded successfully into Terraform Cloud, and we're ready to start making use of it. Now I've taken some liberties here, such as already filling in some of the variables. So in this particular instance, we're deploying this website out to AWS. So we need to have some basic things like which region we're going to deploy this resource to, as well as our public key and our secret access key and access key ID. So those are all things that are dependent upon your own environment. From that point, we can hit our queue plan and just say, this is the same thing as if you're in the CLI typing in Terraform plan. If we scroll down here a little bit, we can see our plan running. So we're going to use Terraform 12.26. It's going to go through, check our configuration. We see that we have 9 different resources that we're planning to add for this configuration as it's been written. Then after that, because our organization has cost estimation enabled, we'll see a rough estimate on what it will take to run this configuration. So after a few seconds, our cost estimation will pop up, and we can see that as part of the configuration that I imported, we're going to be making use of a load balancer. We can see it has an hourly cost of roughly 2.5 cents, as well as an AWS compute instance of roughly again 2.5 cents. We can see some of the monthly cost estimates for that as well. And then, when you start making changes to existing configurations, you'll start to see this delta over here to the right-hand side start to change as well. So we kind of now have an understanding of what we're deploying and how much that's going to cost if we were to deploy it. Then we get into our policy as code section here. So we can see that our policy check hard failed. Okay, so what does that exactly mean? So walking through this, we have two different policies that are being checked with this. We can see the one passed and one failed. So going through to our log here, let me scroll up here. So our first policy here, this is our first policy set type of checking for our AWS instance that's being used. This is checking to make sure that we're using a t2.micro instance. This is something that we could configure based on an environment or an organization's configurations. In this case, it's saying false, that is not what our configuration is using. So it failed our configuration plan here. However, the next one that we're doing here is just a timing piece. So it's going back and taking a look and saying, hey, is it read-only Friday? Because if it's read-only Friday, we don't want to deploy anything. We don't want to ruin anybody's Friday, and especially not anybody's weekend. Now, these are some really simplistic Sentinel rules. We can jump over to my other tab here that's out on GitHub and check out some of these basic rules that I was able to create. So just in 13 lines, we were able to tell Sentinel that we want to have a desired instance type of t2.micro, and then we use our main rule down here to say, hey, is the configured instance type, is because it's going through and it's actually pulling information from our Terraform plan. So we can see, like if you step through this, that we're pulling information from Terraform plan, from our resources, from the AWS instance of our web node, and pulling out what's being applied. And we're storing that into a variable, and we want to match that to our desired instance type, being that t2.micro. And that's the policy that failed. So the end result of each one of these Sentinel rules is true or false. In this case, this one was false. Now that one was a little more specific to the service that's being consumed. Now we can also take a look at that other policy rule that we created, which is just a very simplistic, is it Friday? We're importing the time resource, establishing what day of the week it is in a numeral value, and then saying, hey, if this thing is equal to 5, because 5 is Friday, then fail. It's false. So don't let them provision that. Now the other important thing, like if you notice back there, it was a hard failure. It stopped. We couldn't override it. We couldn't go forward any more than that. So if we take a look at our sentinel.hcl file, this is where that enforcement level is made. So our AWS time is a soft mandatory, meaning that, if you really want to deploy those resources, you can give a reason and hit apply anyways. However, the instance type, that's something that we're maintaining that hard consistency on. So we don't want anybody out there to be deploying something that doesn't fall in line with what's been configured for their environment. So those were some simple rules. Now let's take a look at a little more advanced rules. So we'll go back to our workspaces. So we're back at our workspaces prompt here. So we have a couple more workspaces that have been created out here. One is for development workloads, and the other one is for production workloads. Now we can pick either one of these and kind of walk through what it looks like to deploy one of these. So again, we've already created our variables, and we're ready to just go ahead and queue our plan. This is based off of that prior workspace, so the look and feel is going to be very similar to what we saw before. So we're continuing to use 0.12.26. Once it performs our configuration, we can see that it's going to plan to add 9 new resources. And then our cost estimation and our Sentinel policy checks are going to run to tell us whether or not we can continue to move forward here. So if we look at our cost estimation here, come back. there is we're using a little cheaper instance this time, so we've followed in line with our t2.micro instance. So if we go down and check a look at our policies again, we can see that we now have 3 policies. However, one has only advisory failed. So we can see that our AWS time has passed because today's not Friday, so we can go there. Our instance type has passed because we're using that t2.micro instance. And then we have a brand new rule that's in here that's taking a look at our costing. So in this case, it's checking to see if our proposed total monthly cost is going to be less than $10. In this case, looking at our cost estimation, we can see that our load balancer alone is going to be more than that $10. So that's going to advisory failed, and if we're okay with that, we can just continue on with our planning. Now, if we go back to our policy rules, our repository out here, we can then switch our branch into the master branch, which I've included another policy that's out there that's around costing. So as part of this individual rule, we're making use of our TF run package here. So from that we can start pulling some things about costing. So in this case, we could use cost estimation and then pull out our proposed monthly cost and check, is it 10 or not? Now, in your own environment, you're probably going to want to use what's known as Sentinel variables, so that you can put that down there, and then you can change that based upon each individual workspace that you're using. Because if I were to run this against production, we're probably going to get a much larger value. Thus far, we've done some really cool things with AWS services. So let's switch it up. Let's change over to, say, Azure. Here we have a new workspace that's been deployed out here called HashiCat-Azure. This is something that's out there. It's a configuration that's available within the HashiCorp GitHub repository, and allows you to basically deploy a web server that will show you pictures of cats. So therefore, Hashi and cat on Azure. So we've already configured this with some of our variables that we're going to need to have. If you're familiar with Azure, you need to have some service provider type variables, meaning your subscription ID, client ID, and secret, and your tenant ID. Then for this particular configuration, we need our prefix. So in this case, we're going to use HashiCorp because, hey, we're watching a HashiCorp session right now. So we'll go ahead and queue our plan here so that we can kind of see how some of this changes as we move from AWS over to Azure. So our plan is running. Let's see how many things we're going to try and add this time, how many resources we're adding. So in this case, we're adding 8 different resources. Now, unfortunately, I'll have to apologize. My environment here kind of broke this morning, and the cost estimation is not working. So we're going to see a minor error. You should not see that in your own environments. I believe this is just isolated to mine at the moment. But the session must go on. So let's take a look at our policies that we're using for this. Now we can see some very similar policies as to what we saw in the last in our demo basic site. So here we have 2 policies, one passed, one failed. Again, we're continuing to make use of the time rule, that policy, and we actually didn't have to change anything for that. That there's no dependency on which service is being used or which providers are being used. It's simply looking at, is today Friday or not? And then our second rule here is around the Azure instance type. So in this case, we're looking to see, are we using a standard A0 VM size? So we're going to go ahead and discard this run because we want to do we'll mix it up just a little bit. I want to show you a little bit of power for Terraform Cloud. So we'll discard this run, saying adding more later. So discard that run. Going back to an overview of our run, we've done just the one run so far, just that we've manually queued up in Terraform Cloud. Now, let's move over to Visual Studio Code. This is my editor of choice. The one really cool thing is with Visual Studio Code, there's this Terraform plugin. So we can see down here at the bottom, we can do some enablements, form completion, also some other IntelliSense as part of this, plus on top of formatting and other things. It's really cool to be able to access that directly within the editor of your choice. And that one is something that's brand new for HashiCorp. That was something that we recently picked up and took over ownership of. So this is our configuration here. This is just the main.tf. We can see some of the variables that I described within Terraform Cloud on our top couple lines here. And then the rest is directly coming from that HashiCat configuration. Now, one of the things that we want to do is we want a managed disk to be added to this. For whatever reason, we're going to add that on here. So I'm going to cheat just a little bit and bring over a resource block for our managed disk. We're just basically saying, hey, we want this new disk of this name placed within our resource group that we created on the step before that, and we want it to be about 1 terabyte in size. So we can save that, save our file. Off to the left-hand side here, we can see through some Git integration with Visual Studio Code, our main TF file has had a change. So we're going to commit that, or rather stage that in, and then we're going to add a commit message here. We're going to add a managed disk. Oops. There we go. So I just committed that to the local repository. Going over here to our more actions, we can say push. So we can see some actions that are happening over here. That's going out to our GitHub repository where this is located and stored. Then, if we go back to Terraform Cloud, we have a new run already in motion here. And we can see that this matches up to that commit message that I used within GitHub. So we can click on this and kind of see where we're at here. So we've already kind of processed through the plan. Instead of those 8 resources that we were adding before, we're now up to 9 because of that new managed disk. So it looks like that just about, there we go. So that just wrapped up. Our cost estimation again is not going to succeed within my own environment. So it's going to go ahead and head on down to our policy check afterwards. We didn't change anything within our configuration with regards to size, so we still have 1 passed and 1 failed policy. But since we added that managed disk, we're a fairly security conscious organization. So we want to apply some Center for Internet Security benchmarks for that managed disk. So let's hit our discard run here. Add in a nice little message. And then, thanks to our foundational policies library that we have a link to right here at the top of your workspace, we can click on that. It's going to take us out to our GitHub repository. This is the location of all of those policies that have been pre-written for us to make use of. Now the README has all kinds of information about what's included, more information about each of those pieces, and kind of walks through how we can make use of them. But I'm going to show you a really quick way for us to do that immediately. So we can start by clicking on CIS. That's the Center for Internet Security again. Then we have access to the benchmarks for each of those services. In this case, we're working with Azure, so we're going to click on Azure. Now, what we're doing is we just add a managed disk, and we're trying to follow some of the CIS policies or benchmarks for storage, and they happen to have one that's for managed disks. So let's scroll down here a little bit. So we can see the different policy or the different benchmarks that have been created for Azure within the storage area. And actually, storage is not where I want to be. I believe I want to be in compute. Yes, there we go. We want to make sure that all of our managed disks are encrypted. So this is CIS 7.1. You know, if you're using the benchmarks within your own environment, you can look that up and see what it's doing. But all we have to do to make use of this within our own policies, within our own policy set here is copy this and head on over to our sentinel.hcl file. You know, in this case, we should recognize some of these, Azure Time and Azure Instance Type, and just paste in that rule there. Now, really, the magic of what's happening here is due to our source parameter. You know, the source parameter is heading on out to our GitHub repository where that exists, because it has actually, you know, all of the hard stuff has been done and been placed out there. So let me go right back to that. So we can click on our 7.1, we can open that up, and then we can see some of the test-based information for creating that, and then we can see the individual rule itself. You know, these are a little more complex than the rules that I wrote. So you'll notice that right off the bat. But they're extremely easy to run and apply to your own environment. So going back to Visual Studio Code here, we can save our sentinel.hcl file. We can see some of the updates on the left-hand side here. We're going to add that to our change. We're going to update to, or create our commit right here saying that we're updating to apply CIS 7.1 to our policy sets. Then we can push that out to GitHub, where Terraform Cloud is accessing the policy sets. That's the back end for those. And you're not limited to GitHub. I should throw that out. You can use whatever VCS that you prefer. So, you know, understand that there's no limitation or constraint on using GitHub there. So we can now go ahead and queue up our plan and see, did we apply CIS 7.1 to our managed disk and the other disks within our configuration appropriately. So our plan is going to continue to run. You've seen no changes have been made to our Terraform configuration, so we're still adding 9 new resources. Then it's going to run through cost estimation, and it's going to hit our policy checks. There we go. So now we can see, we can walk through our different policies right here and take a look at each one of them. So, you know, the bottom readout down here, just checking to make sure that it's not read-only Friday. While I've been presenting this, the day has not changed, so still not Friday, so we're still good from that aspect. Still return to true. Then if we go up a little bit more, we see a little more verbose output here from our CIS 7.1 policy here. Oops, sorry. There we go. So the result here is false, so it failed. And we can kind of check and run through and see some additional information about what exactly failed and get some additional information. And then our top policy here, policy number 1, goes back to our instance type. So that is still not a standard A0, so that is still continues to fail. So that was a quick run through of some of the demos that are available for making easy use of policy as code within your organization today. So just to review, we went through, took a look at some cost and estimation for AWS, seeing the difference between different instance types as well as the load balancer that's been configured. We also took a look at using policy as code through Sentinel to pull out that cost estimation in data to then make decisions, to approve or deny the configuration plan that's been ran. We also check some corporation guidelines, checking a look, okay, if based on whichever environment that we're working on, are they deploying the appropriate instance size or type within that environment for that configuration. We took a look at some infrastructure uniformity, making sure that we can apply that across several different workspaces, taking a look at whether or not that's development or production. And then lastly, we kind of wrapped up with a look at how we can make use of those foundational policies libraries to apply CIS benchmarks to our configurations in a really quick way. So there's some resources that you're going to want to check out today. First and foremost, head on out to the Terraform GitHub repository, grab a copy of Terraform 0.13, get access to those new module arguments, get access to that new way to authenticate to Terraform Cloud, as well as that new way to reach out and grab some of the new community and partner providers within not only the public Terraform registry, but also your own private registries. Then check out Terraform Cloud. It's free, and it's really, from a customer that told me this here recently, it's one of the best ways to share remote state that's out there. So I think that's a fantastic resource. Plus, it gets you access to some of the cost estimation as well as policy as code, to establish those guardrails to your information or to your infrastructure as code-based practices. And that's the last piece right here, adding checks, adding those guardrails, making sure that, as people are deploying their infrastructure, they're following not only the service best practices, but your organization's best practices as well. Plus, we've created some really great pre-written policies that are out there based on the Center for Internet Security benchmarks that's out there just on the foundational policies library. So to wrap up, my name is Kyle Ruddy. I'm a Senior Technical Product Marketing Manager here at HashiCorp covering Terraform. Some of my contact information is on the screen. Please reach out if you have comments, questions, if you want to see some more things about individual services or anything that you prefer. I'm more than available. So with that, thank you very much and enjoy the rest of HashiConf.
Thank you very, very much, Carl. And actually, I'd like to welcome Carl back for a live Q&A discussion panel. And he's going to be joined alongside me and Domi by Larry Smith Jr. So just a quick call to action. If you have any questions for Larry or for Carl, any general policy as code questions, please do ask them in the questions section below me. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Domi to kick us off. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Hi Larry, hi Kyle. Thank you so much for the chat. First of all, you're not the only one that has one of these, so I think it's a bit of a theme. This is nothing to do with any of the questions of the panel, but I just wanted to do a little shout out for the doggo. So I'm just going to kick us off with a few questions. So why should one use policy as code? Could you give us a use case? Let's start with Kyle.
I mean, all kinds of reasons. I mean, for the most part, one of the things is trying to, when you're getting into this whole infrastructure as code notion, and you're really starting to allow types of people to really deploy anything that they want to. I mean, we're talking basically self-service. How do you take some of those business rules and apply that to the infrastructure as code type of system that's being used today? And really, that's where policy as code, that's where Sentinel comes into place to kind of help provide those those business level constraints and controls to the folks who are able to provision essentially whatever they need as needed.
Yeah, and I'd like to add to that. And I mean, that's a great point, Kyle, is that, some of these, doing policy as code, not only obviously because it's in code, you're able to audit it much easier and things like that when it comes to audits. The days of the auditing trails are minimized, but it does remove a lot of those moving parts that get in the way, day-to-day delivery of certain things. So I just wanted to add that real quick. So for sure.
Yeah, obviously. Thank you. That's useful. So what would you say the best way to get started is? Larry, would you answer that one?
I think from getting started perspective, taking it from a Sentinel perspective, really getting into the weeds of how to understand how you develop these policies. Kyle showed some really good examples. But really, I think to get started, people from a organization perspective really need to sit down and kind of map out what are the things that we're doing today that are policy driven. That could be anything, security measures, all the way down to resources. How are we trying to restrict our budgets, things like that. Map those out and start to translate those over time into what these Sentinel policies look like.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Kyle, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, just kind of echoing what Larry was referencing there, having that kind of understanding of what the business requires, what types of rules and policies are being applied today to maybe more static workloads. And then, heading on out to the HashiCorp site for Learn. There's some really great documentation and labs that you can run through on how to really just easily get started, crafting those rules once you have it documented.
Absolutely.
Amazing. Thank you. So I've got a funny little anecdote. So one of my former colleagues sent me this the other day. He was like, you can order a pizza from Domino's using Terraform Cloud. This Terraform code can be linked to a Terraform Cloud workspace, enabling pizzas to be ordered via Terraform Cloud after you set variables with information for yourself, your credit card, and the store you want to order from. So this is a very fun repo from R. Berlin, order-a-pizza. And one of my team said, I think I found my favorite Sentinel policy, which is no pineapple. What is the weirdest or coolest rule you have implemented?
I would like to steal that one. That's actually a good one.
I'll send you the link shortly.
Yeah.
So could you tell me what your weirdest or coolest rule is that you've implemented?
I was, as I'm thinking about this, I don't know that I've done any that would be really like unique per se. But one thing that I like to do from a policy perspective, it's going to sound really simplistic, but if you think about it in the context of where I'm going to take this, is enforcing tags. From my perspective, is enforcing tagging on resources in your infrastructure allows me to get really creative, not just from a policy perspective, but how I leverage those resources downstream. So what I mean is, at provisioning time, if I enforce tagging, I can actually do some translations after the resources are up and running that allow me to do config management. So taking Ansible perspective per se, that I can actually create Ansible groups based on tags, and I know what that looks like. So you can start defining what that flow looks like. So I don't know if that's really unique, but that's one thing that I definitely encourage for sure.
Yeah, makes sense. I mean, it sounds like you can use it for all sorts of things. So what about Kyle? Did you do you have anything fun or noteworthy to share?
I mean, my favorite one is still, read-only Fridays. Like the person who told me about that, I was like, that is genius.
Yes.
And that is going into every one of my demos as long as you tell me it's okay, because that's just hilarious.
That is awesome.
So the thing about read-only Fridays is kind of there's a bit of a hot take that if you don't want to deploy anything on Fridays, you should probably look at your code first before you implement a rule like that. testing and production.
Ooh,
I don't know.
fire.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's a great point.
Hey.
Not, just to add to what you said, down the road, we should have more discussion around what this, Sentinel means as far as code reviews. Is something that is a useful conversation down, later on at some point as well.
Yeah, I agree. All right, I think it's time to get to see if there's any questions from the audience. Rob, what do you have for us?
We have quite a few, but I just want to say I really love the read-only Friday Sentinel rule. I just want to come into work and just watch Netflix, that's all.
Here you go.
Right, okay. So,
and pizza with no pineapple.
Precisely. Okay, so we'll kick off here. This is a good one. So what's the difference between Sentinel and OPA languages and the goals? So I will probably give that one to Larry, I think.
Can you repeat the question again?
Sure, no problem. So what's the difference between Sentinel and OPA languages and goals? So I think they're talking about Open Policy Agent.
Yeah, I'll be honest. I haven't used Open Policy Agent, so maybe Kyle's actually better for that, if he knows. That's a great question.
To you, Kyle.
But...
Yeah, I mean, they're essentially, the goals in the end are the same. We're both creating declarative-based policy engines to, apply these rule sets to our configurations that are being created and deployed. One, Sentinel is created by us at HashiCorp, and so it's going to be more focused on HashiCorp products and some of the more intricate pieces and parts that are being used, whereas OPA is going to be a little broader. It's going to be able to be used against several different products in many different ways. So both are about the same, and conceptually, just where do you want to use it?
Amazing. Thank you very much. So we'll move on to another question, and this one is from Bjorn. So Bjorn says, I wasn't aware of Sentinel. I guess it's enterprise only. So the first question is, A, is it a limited version in amounts of policy that you can use in a free version? And B, are there any plans to add the free version in a limited way? So I'm guessing he's asking if Sentinel is going to come in some sort of limited capacity to the open source side of things.
Yeah, hopefully it does.
Yeah, so currently right now, Sentinel can be used with Terraform Enterprise as well as Terraform Cloud. And then when you use it with Terraform Cloud, because Cloud has a couple different tiers, it works with the governance package. So there is a fee, or there is a license that is required for that. One of the things that I do want to call out is that if you want to kind of try it before you buy it, there is the option for a trial configuration so that you can use that with Terraform Cloud, write some of your own policies and apply that to your configurations to kind of feel out how it works. There is also the option that you can download the CLI and write some of your own policies just to see how the engine works. That was one of the first ways that I got started using things like date and some of the other pieces that you can add in just locally on my own system. It's a good development environment. Whether or not we get it to the point where it's going to be open source, it's kind of still up in the air. That is something that I've thrown back to our product managers quite a bit, because I mean there's definitely a voice in the community from Larry as well as so many others that would really like to see that happen. So fingers crossed that that's something that we can talk about in the future.
And let me add real quick too, and that's a great point, because it does require that top tier really of Terraform Cloud in order to actually use the policies. Like Kyle said, you can actually do CLI commands and do some validation and things like that, but you can't really see it in the works. But I would just kind of echo what Kyle said. In the community wise, I think I'm just going to say I think it's paramount that that we get some sort of availability that we can use, even if it's limited, even in Terraform Cloud, even at the lower tiers, because Sentinel's been around 3-4 years now from some perspective, in some flavor and across different products. But getting adoption is going to be I think to get adoption will require that open source feel more so than a top tier paid thing. So we'll see how that plays out. But again, fingers crossed. Let's see what happens.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. We have more questions, but I just want to latch on to that last question, just with a question of my own. So at the moment, we're talking a lot about policy as code using Sentinel with regards to Terraform and Terraform Cloud. From my own experience, I've seen Sentinel in use with Vault, but are there any other products that Sentinel can be used with?
I believe, isn't it? You can do it in console too, can't you?
Yep.
Amazing.
Yeah, so it's not just something that's limited to Terraform. You can definitely use it across the board.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, so we'll move on. So how will Sentinel work with HCP with Terraform SaaS?
To be defined, to come, still being evaluated.
I love those responses there.
To be defined.
Right, we have, I think we have 4 more questions. So here we go. So we use AWS Control Tower and guardrails to control resource creation. Could Sentinel stop an S3 bucket being created with public access, for example? Have you had other clients use AWS Control Tower alongside Sentinel? That's probably a Kyle question, I would imagine.
Actually, Larry, have you done anything?
I have not.
Control Tower? Okay.
I have not actually. I'm very limited on my AWS, and that's a whole other conversation. So we'll see.
All right. Figured I'd throw it out there for the whole real world use case type deal. As far as I'm aware, I haven't talked to too many people who are actually doing that today. That is something that people are planning, who are looking into it. So I don't have any real success stories at the moment, but generally, that shouldn't be a problem as far as I'm aware. To be able to integrate that piece to set up some of the restricted access to your S3 buckets and some of those other resources. I mean, definitely test and verify, but as far as I'm aware.
And don't break stuff.
Brilliant.
Definitely don't break.
I mean,
at least not on Friday.
So on the breaking stuff thing, there's like this whole, sorry to barge in for this, but like, shouldn't you break things on purpose so you know how to fix it?
Of course. Hey, break things fast and often, right? That's what I say. Just not on Friday, and then no pizza with that pineapple. Let's make sure.
Fair enough.
That is the best way to learn, I've found. So.
And plenty of beer. How about that?
Okay, moving on. We have another question. Is there a repo for official-like gov requirement policies available? So I don't know if they're talking about governance requirements or government requirements, but I'll read the question again just to see if there's a different interpretation of it. Is there a repo for official-like gov requirements policies available?
There's some, Kyle, you may be more familiar. I saw them not long ago. I believe, doesn't HashiCorp actually have a GitHub repo that has a bunch of governments examples that cover many different scenarios that have been around for several years now, I think. Are you familiar with that, Kyle? I think there's a governance one as part of that.
So we have 2 main repos that are out there. One is the Foundational Policies Library, which was discussed in the session. And currently right now that's only for the Center for Internet Security benchmarks. So not really anything focused on government related work, which I believe is the question. But there is another one it's a repo full of Sentinel policies that have been crafted and shared through our SE, as well as some of our other internal folks that's out there and available. I don't know if they have anything government related, but there are. It's a complete wealth of just well-written Sentinel policies. So there might be some things in there, but I don't know offhand if it's anything particularly around government.
Okay, cool. Thank you very, very much. So this actually ties in with a question that's going to be asked later on. And I think, Larry, you touched on it earlier on. The question is, where can users learn to code Sentinel policy code without access to Terraform Cloud/Enterprise? Are there online resources available for newbies to get into and try out and get comfortable with Sentinel? So again, I'll throw that back to Larry, sorry, to Kyle, because I know you touched on it earlier on.
Yeah, so one really good way to do is kind of what we were talking about. If we had a better reference to what we're saying as some of these example policies, but again, if you go to GitHub or go to Google and look up HashiCorp Sentinel examples, I think you'll probably find it, just to get a familiarity of what the language looks like, and you'll be able to actually start playing with some of those. But like Kyle said, you can use the Sentinel. There's a Sentinel installation guide that you can follow to install Sentinel and practice with those rules. But really, to get into really using that, I would recommend going to Terraform Cloud. And like Kyle said as well, you will need to sign up. Remember, fingers crossed, let's get this, some other way. But you will have to sign up for a trial to actually use that top tier of Terraform Cloud in order to actually see those in the works. So, Kyle, you got anything to add to that?
Nope. Spot on, Larry.
Not bad for early in the morning.
How long is the trial for, just out of interest?
I think it's 30 days, isn't it, Kyle?
Yeah, I believe so.
It's 30 or 60. I can't remember. I think it's 30.
Sure,
Yeah,
it's not.
I haven't tried it. I'm totally kidding, but
Okay. Okay, brilliant. So we'll move on to the next question. We have this question here. I'm not sure if I would like to have cost/policy checks in my infrastructure as code tool. Would it not be better to integrate into available cloud functionality? In the case of Azure, cost management policies. That's quite a general question. I think I'll give that one to Larry.
I didn't, you cut out on me there. I can't. So it was around Azure. What was the question again?
Sure, no worries. I'll repeat it. So
Sorry about
the question
that.
was, I'm not sure if I would like to have costs/policy checks in my infrastructure as code tool. Would it not be better to integrate into available cloud functionality? In the case of Azure, cost management/policies.
So let me take it from this perspective. Depending on the route you want to take, I mean, obviously, as long as you have a workflow, I'm just going to say it honestly. Obviously, it makes a lot of sense to put it within Terraform if you're going to use that Sentinel foundation. But as long as just generalizing policy as code, as long as you have something integrated in your workflow, and that is obviously driven by pipelines, et cetera, so you're not doing the handoff to humans, I think at the end of the day, as long as you're doing it, just do it. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's just my perspective, taking on policy as code as a general conception.
Yeah, and I would echo the same thing. I mean, it's all about having some sort of way to manage that, having some sort of way to establish that, having it, being used as a standard across the board. Because in the end, it's all about just making sure that you have access to the information you're processing as part of your pipeline, to make sure that you are, following the rules and the guidance that you've been, basically, told to maintain. So if it works with Sentinel and it works with cost estimation through Terraform, fantastic. If it works better with Azure or any of those other services, like the recommendation is absolutely to use those functionalities. It just comes down to you and where you're more comfortable with applying them.
Yep. Just start doing it is what I say.
I think
I think a famous sports brand has said something about that.
Exactly.
won't say any names.
Exactly.
Right, I just want.
We're not getting any pay for this.
It was me, by the way. So.
I just want to echo a comment that Larry made. He said it's about workflows. So in my years of experience being a practitioner, I've never really gone with a specific vendor because the tool was really good at what it does. I've always gone with what fits best with the workflow. So I think I would just echo both responses to that question there. If you have a workflow that works for you and there's no reason to introduce something else into it, then there's no need to do that. At the end of the day, we're trying to make our lives as easy as possible. We are practitioners and we don't need to introduce unneeded complexity. So if it's not going to make your life easier, then you have to do what's best for you. So yeah, definitely wanted to echo that.
100%.
And can I add one thing? If I've got time, let me add one thing to that because,
sure.
And you're spot on. The other thing that I think that people need to keep in mind as you start, not just policy as code, I mean, anything that we're talking about workflows, make sure you're not pigeonholing yourself into any one technology. Make sure you have an exit plan along the way to allow you to be as agnostic as possible. I want to talk. I can't talk about that enough. So.
Definitely have to agree. Okay, we have one final audience question, which is, can HCL policies work across repos? I'll give that one to Kyle.
Yeah. I guess there's two ways to look at it, depending upon how that was intended. But so there's this notion of what's called policy sets, in which case you can create multiple policy sets that are focused on one particular repository. Policy set A looks at repository A, policy set B looks at repository B, and then you can assign those to whichever workspaces that you're using, even organizations, in order to apply those. You're not constrained to one single repository. You can use several. And even with that, with this notion of policy sets, you can write different individual rules within each one of those repositories, and then you kind of surface those up with your .sentinel policy there at the end.
All right.